Welcome to today's panel on validity and equity problems in law school teaching evaluations. I'm Hari Osofsky, the Dean of Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, and I'm honored to be part of today's important and much needed conversation. I want to start by just giving an enormous thank you to Hofstra Professor Irina Manta and Northwestern Professor and Vice Dean Sarah Losky for developing the idea for this panel and organizing our panel today. I'm also just incredibly grateful to our panelists, St. John's Professor Renee Nicole Allen, Georgetown Professor Jason Brennan, UNC Professor Rebecca Pritzker, Southern University Law Center Professor Catherine McFarland, and Rutgers Law School Professor Adam Scales for sharing their research and insights on the problem of validity and equity in law school teaching evaluations and how we might address them. I also want to give a big thank you to some people from our Northwestern team who helped make this virtual version of this panel possible, particularly Melissa Kieser, Jill Brislin, Katrina Peters, and Hope Rehak from our law school. So today's panel focuses on a crucial problem. On the one hand, it's extremely important for us to get feedback on teaching from our students. They are a mechanism for students being heard, for feedback, and for addressing concerns. On the other hand, as our panelists will describe, there's important research making it clear that evaluations have both validity and bias concerns. We know that scores don't reflect an objective comparing of courses, that a lot of things other than the quality of the course influence what those numbers are. And also that specifically people's biases can influence how they evaluate a professor. They sometimes can come out in really inappropriate comments, but also in more subtle ways that can deflate scores based on identity, even though the comments might not directly address race, gender, disability, sexual orientation, et cetera, or proxies for them. We also know that intersectionality matters in this context and in the biases that people face. Now, why is this dilemma so important? This dilemma is so important because these evaluations are used in hiring, they're used in promotion and tenure decisions, and so they really matter in someone's career. But this conversation also matters because I think we have to situate it in the broader context of inequality and barriers that people face. You know, I've been part of a group of deans, for example, amplifying Miradeo's really important work, looking at, you know, some of the inequalities that professors who are women of color face. And she's looked in particular also at what's happened during COVID. But we know that there's unequal formal and informal service and other burdens, right? That these evaluations are happening in the context of. You know, I've been reflecting this week on the broader context also, as, you know, we've seen just in the last few weeks on various blogs, listing of the most downloaded professors and the most cited professors on those blogs. You know, so we like SSR and download, citation counts, et cetera. You know, it's been remarked on by a number of people. And of course, there've been studies on this also. The continuing lack of diversity in the most downloaded and cited people. And so this evaluations issue, it's not occurring in isolation. It's not just about the evaluations, which is an important problem to fix, but it's about sort of getting at not only this sort of intersectionality of identity, which is part of what's influencing these evaluations, but also the intersectionality of this evaluations problem with the other kinds of barriers that people are facing in the academy. And so I think it's really important that this conversation be understood in that broader context. And as part of a broader conversation that we need to be having about how we support recruitment and retention of a diverse faculty, but also how we're creating a supportive environment that supports people to success. And again, part of what makes this evaluation issue in particular so tricky is that it is important that we hear from students. And so the question is, how do we do it in a way that gets at these validity and bias concerns? I come to this conversation as someone who's now in my second deanship, currently at Northwestern Pritzker Law, but I also come to this conversation as a professor who experienced these issues. So, as a dean, I want to make sure that we develop an approach that acknowledges these problems and finds ways to approach them that addresses these concerns of validity and bias. So I want to make sure that however I'm using these evaluations to evaluate my faculty as a dean, we're doing it in the most valid and fair way possible. But I also want to mention that, my lived experiences influence also how I think about it as a dean, right? So, I had an experience that when I was reading sort of the really insightful analysis that a number of our speakers today will share around validity and bias, I was thinking about an example of a validity problem that I encountered early in my career. So I switched from one law school to another, and I suddenly noticed a dip in my evaluations. And I looked around and realized that the professors who were getting the highest ratings in their evaluations were ones who were giving students answers, right? And so I had a conversation with my dean at the time who said to me, look, since you're pre-tenure, why don't you try doing it and see if it helps? And I struggled with this because I thought it was pedagogically less good than what I was doing. And yet I felt pressure to do something pedagogically less good to teach to the evaluation. And so the compromise I came to is I only asked questions in the PowerPoints in class, but after class, I would post PowerPoints with answers. The answers, of course, were largely, it depends. But the really troubling thing was that my evaluations went up. So giving the students the answers, even if I actually thought it was not as pedagogically strong as what I was doing before, improved the assessment of me. And so this is, I use this example as one, and of course there are lots and lots of other examples and types of validity issues, but as one that I encountered as I was coming up in the academy. The other thing that I encountered a lot coming up in the academy, and of course, I'm a white woman, so I don't face some of the barriers that we're going to be talking about today. But I do, there was a point when I was younger than I am now, less distinguishable from students, and female, and I experienced on more than one occasion, both in conversations with students in my class and in my teaching evaluations, people who were literally taking my class for the first time and had no background expertise in the subject matter. When I was, say, in my fourth time teaching international law, coming and telling me how I should be teaching it, how, sort of assuming a lack of expertise in my subject matter, even though I clearly had tremendously more expertise than the person giving me this feedback. And so, I think one of the really difficult things around how do we get at these bias issues is that, as I said, some of it is blatant. And in some ways, those are the ones where you can look at this and say, okay, we're going to completely discount this, right? There's clearly bias here. But how it deflates, how people's perceptions deflate the numbers, and there's, as we'll talk about in this panel, good research that it does. What does that mean when we're then using it as a metric to evaluate people, evaluate whether they're a good teacher that we want on our faculty, evaluate whether their teaching is strong enough for tenure or promotion or their issues in the classroom, right? So how do we both help people improve as teachers, but also make sure that we're not being unfair in the way that we're using feedback? And so I am just so grateful, as I said, to both Professor Manta and Vice Dean Osofsky for the work of putting together this panel, and all of our panelists, because I think this is a crucial issue in our efforts to increase sort of equity in the academy, and ensure that we're really supporting people to success, and supporting recruitment and retention of diverse faculty. With that, I want to turn it over to our organizer, Professor Irina Manta. to introduce our panelists and panel. But I get the great pleasure of getting to introduce her. So she's a professor of law and founding director of the Center for Intellectual Property Law at Hofstra. She has a really interesting intersectional expertise in intellectual property, internet law, and immigration law, and an interest in the intersection between law and social science. She's widely published and currently writing a book about legal issues related to online dating apps, which is clearly a rather hot topic. She's also a co-author in a textbook on criminal law. She's an intellectual property and blogs for the Validity conspiracy. And in 2014 received the Lawrence A. Stesson Prize for Outstanding Scholarly Publications from Hofstra. And she's really, her reach is both national and international, including having served as a visiting scholar in Japan. So with that, I want to, again, give a big thank you for your organizing efforts and turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Dean Osofsky. I want to express my gratitude not only to the Dean and Vice Dean Sarlowski, but also everybody else at Northwestern who made this first of its kind event happen. And a big, big thank you to our speakers who I'll be introducing shortly. The multidisciplinary event that you're seeing today also grew from countless conversations that I had with academics all over the country and across disciplines. There are too many of them to thank them here individually, but they know who they are. So before I introduce our speakers, I want to say a couple of words about the stigma that has surrounded this topic. And I hope that we can finally shed that today. So there's been a lot of whispering behind closed doors about it and people chatting about it and often being upset, but expressing concerns or misgivings about the system of numerical and qualitative student evaluations that we have today has long been accompanied by fear. The fear that one is going to be considered a bad teacher. And nobody in the academy wants that, pretty much. So as we're going to see today, at times, to their credit, it's professors who actually have sky-high evaluations who are willing to be some of the harshest critics of the system because of what they see as the flaws of this system due to validity and bias issues. As Dean Osofsky mentioned, these evaluations can be critical to an academic's career when they're used to make or to justify decisions having to do with hiring, promotion, tenure, or pay. For some individuals, they're going to determine whether these individuals get to stay in academia at all. Additionally, I would be remiss not to mention the significant mental health and demoralization effects that we have seen from evaluations, effects that only seem to have gotten worse during the pandemic. Anecdotally, many professors report in many different forms how hard they're working and how they're trying to promote learning as passionately and creatively as possible, but they're seeing no payoffs, or in fact, they're seeing drops in their final ratings. We must ask ourselves what kind of teaching and behavior we are currently incentivizing and whether it is best serving our students. So with that, let me introduce our fantastic panel, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which each person will present. And after all the speakers go through, we're going to open it up to Q&A. You can certainly drop your questions anytime, and then I will select from those to ask our speakers. Let's start with Professor Rebecca Pritzker, who is an associate professor of public policy at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In addition to the really interesting research that she does on American political behavior and institutions, she specializes in the empirical study of teaching evaluations and the many biases that affect them, which includes effects based on faculty, gender, and race. One of her recent publications on this topic with her co-author Jenny Sweet-Cushman is called Evaluating Student Evaluations of Teaching, a Review of Measurement and Equity Bias in SATs and Recommendations for Ethical Reform, which appeared in the Journal of Academic Ethics. Then we have Professor Renee Allen, who's an assistant professor of legal writing at the St. John's University School of Law. Her scholarly expertise includes social justice, legal education, generations, and educational psychology. She recently published an article entitled From Academic Freedom to Cancel Culture, Silencing Black Women in the Legal Academy, which appeared in the UCLA Law Review. So very happy to have her with us today. Then Professor Catherine McFarlane is an associate professor of law at the Southern University Law Center, and her expertise focuses on civil rights litigation and other questions of disability law, including the challenges that are involved in obtaining reasonable accommodations. One of her recent articles in that area is entitled Disability Without Documentation and appeared in the Fordham Law Review. Then we have with us Professor Adam Scales, who's a professor of law at the Rutgers Law School. His scholarly focus is on administrative law, insurance law, and torts. He has also served as the vice dean of Rutgers, and he drew some attention during that time to the problem of teaching evaluations when, as was reported in the educational press, he issued a statement to Rutgers law students to stop making inappropriate and sexist comments about female professors, such as about their clothing. Last but not least, we have Professor Jason Brennan, who's the Robert J. and Elizabeth Flanagan Family Term Professor of Strategy, Economics, Ethics, and Public Policy at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University, where he also directs the Institute for the Study of Markets and Ethics. He is especially interested in politics, philosophy, and economics, and he has published, among many other books, one entitled Cracks in the Ivory Tower, The Moral Mess of Higher Education. We are really, really fortunate to have all these speakers here. And with that, Professor Kreitzer, please take it away.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this really important conversation. As the previous two speakers have already mentioned, this has been a topic that people have been speaking about in hallways and emails for a long time, but there hasn't been a systematic discussion about the reckoning that we need to have about evaluations and the role that they play in higher ed. As has already been said, standard evaluations of teaching, what I'll call SETs, are ubiquitous in higher education. There's a growing body of evidence that indicates that these measures are not only poor indicators of teaching, but also that there are clear patterns in terms of equity bias that's based off of the instructor's identity. Because these evaluations play a key part in hiring, promotion, and tenure, it's really important that we confront this evidence directly. Beyond the harm that it can play in people's professional career, I'll just briefly say that SETs can also be emotionally and psychologically damaging, especially the racist and sexist comments that are often seen in qualitative remarks. I'll share one of mine, which was on one of my first teaching evaluations, which said, "I liked the small group work you do, but I don't like your pants." My pants, all of my pants, that I'm wearing pants. I can't tell you how much time I spent thinking about my pants, which is really irrelevant to my teaching. There's some people who have been calling for SETs to be thrown out because of these issues of measurement and equity bias. But on the other hand, we surely need to keep professors and our faculty accountable by learning what's going on in their classrooms. I've been tasked with giving an overview of the literature and framing the discussion. Then I'll focus more on some forms of equity bias, the gender and race literature in particular. I'll end talking about some ways that we can mitigate some of these issues. Professor Scales will talk later about resistance to systemic change. So in light of the unlikelihood of systemic change, I offer some recommendations on how to make SETs less bad. So with that, I'll start with giving a broad overview. So we can classify the issues with teaching evaluations into two categories. The first I call measurement bias, and the second is equity bias. Professor John Brennan, one of the later panelists, will talk in more detail about measurement bias. So I'll only give a brief overview of it now so that you can wrap your head around it for the remainder of the talks. So measurement bias occurs when variables unrelated to teaching effectiveness influence the results in SETs. There are many common examples, but these include things like the class time. Students don't like 8 a.m. classes. The class size, if the class is required or an elective class. The class difficulty, the discipline. Classes with lighter workloads and higher grading distributions get higher scores. Evaluations are higher for upper level discussion-based classes and lowest for large introductory classes. These vary across disciplines. So in the natural sciences, courses receive the lowest scores, and humanities tend to have higher scores. We even know that bringing cookies or chocolate to class increases your eval. So perhaps that's the advice that you should have gotten earlier in your career, Professor Osofsky. Okay, so we know in general that the best evidence, the meta-analyses of SETs indicate that the learning correlation is 0. So on this basis alone, we should already be kind of concerned about how ubiquitous SETs are in higher education. So to the second part is to talk more about equity bias. Equity bias occurs when variables outside the instructor's control systematically affect the results. Common examples of this include the instructor's gender, race, ethnicity, accent, sexual orientation, disability, and I'm sure there's many others that I haven't mentioned as well. There's evidence that some of these biases can be more pronounced in some disciplines. So some studies find that, for example, in the natural sciences, the bias is much greater. A Rate My Professor analysis of 8 million Rate My Professor reviews shows that there's no single discipline where the female faculty receive higher evaluative scores than male faculty. So here are some examples of how this plays out. Men are perceived to be seen as more adept, brilliant, and organized instructors. They are seen as more accurate in teaching. They are perceived to have higher levels of education, perceived to be less sexist, provide better feedback, and are less harshly penalized for being tough graders. Experimental designs that hold constant all of those things in online classes and only switch the perception of the gender show that when students think that the instructor is a woman, they receive lower scores. We also know that students are more likely to expect special favors and accommodations from female faculty members. So we've seen that a lot during the pandemic. And they tend to penalize women for not upholding or not going out of their way to provide some of these extra accommodations. We also know that in general, men score higher on global measures of teaching effectiveness, but on some of the individual metrics, like did your professor do this or that, women might be higher on some of those. One thing that's important to know is that women and men appear to be evaluated by students of all genders through the lens of gender stereotypes. So women faculty are rated highly for having very stereotypically feminine traits like warmth and compassion and sensitivity by male and female students. And men are evaluated on more traditional male traits like perceptions of intelligence. Well, these gender stereotypes pose a significant quandary because students prefer professors to have masculine traits, but penalize women for not conforming to feminine stereotypes. In fact, there's some evidence to indicate that conformity to these prescribed gender roles has a more pronounced effect than gender does itself. It's also relevant to note that that instructors are also, the evaluation of instructors is also shaped by who the student is. So not surprisingly, the research shows a gender affinity effect, whereby students rate faculty that share their gender more highly. Female students tend to slightly prefer women instructors, and male students strongly prefer male instructors. The difference in the slight and strong there is why women tend to have lower evaluations, despite the fact that there are more women in college today. Some studies show that a student's level of sexism predicts how much they perceive the professor to be sexist, though this finding is only significant among conservative students. There's not evidence on a racial affinity effect, but based on the literature about racial affinity in general, I would suspect that there are some similar trends. In general, there is far less research on equity bias in teaching evaluations for faculty of color, in part because of their severe underrepresentation in academia, makes statistical analyses to isolate the effect very difficult. However, the research that we do have indicates that faculty of color are evaluated worse than their white colleagues, especially Black and Asian professors, with Black male professors faring especially poorly. We also know that faculty with accents fare worse than their white and native English-speaking counterparts. We know that faculty with accents and Asian last names have lower evaluative scores in both SETs and Rate My Professor. And we also know that intersectionality plays a role here too, and that people of color may be punished more for intersectional stereotype conformity. So for example, Latina women are perceived less warmly than Anglo women with similarly strict teaching styles. There's a lot less empirical evidence about equity bias in other groups. There's some evidence to suggest that LGBTQ faculty fare worse than their straight colleagues and are seen as more politically biased than heterosexual faculty. Some research indicates that seniority decreases bias, but other research indicates that younger professors are seen as more popular and receive higher evaluative scores. We know very little about biases against other intersectional identities such as pregnancy or disability. Very briefly and somewhat in summary, it's very hard to assess the scope of equity bias for some of the reasons that I've mentioned previously. One is the intersectional and compounding effects of gender, race, age, disability, nationality, etc., which complicate a straightforward measure of bias. Another is that the effect of bias varies across disciplines, and in some disciplines, such as humanities, women and people of color are likely to be advantaged. There's also likely gender and racial affinity effects, not to mention all of the measurement bias. So for these reasons, it's really difficult to say that the effect of gender bias is, and then to provide a number, though people ask me all the time, like, how big is the gender bias? Because of the conditional nature of that, there's not very many estimates, but one study that I know of shows that female instructors receive ratings that are about 1/2 standard deviation lower than men's ratings. And like I said, we do not have a good measure of racial bias because of the lack of our ability to study it in a very systematic way. I want to end by giving a couple of suggestions for how we can make SETs less bad. I take the position here, acknowledging that in the face of resistance to systemic change, there are some things that we can advocate for change now, and many of these things are somewhat easy to implement. And so I encourage you to talk to these with your deans and fellow administrators. So the first thing that's important for us to consider is that we should better contextualize what SETs are. Students cannot and arguably should not be evaluating teaching. They don't have any of the pedagogical background to evaluate the quality of teaching. When we contextualize SETs as perceptions of students' experiences, we can still get useful feedback for faculty and administrators about their experiences. We also have to be more proactive to increase the validity of these assessments by improving the response rate. It's not uncommon to have a response rate of 20%. And we know just based on statistics that a smaller response rate is less likely to be representative. So places that require students to complete SETs are likely to have more representative samples than places where SETs are optional. Administrators should interpret the results very carefully because these SETs were not designed to be comparative across faculty members. That's just not what the literal design of the metric was for. So evaluations are ideally used to compare a faculty member's trajectory over time against themselves, and ideally within a course, because that can help to control for some of those measurement bias issues. And of course, it also controls or holds constant the instructor's identity, which might be a source of bias. It's true that most faculty members get high scores with some negative ones. So in other words, there's a negative skew in the distribution of the data. Whenever you have a negative skew in data, the means are less representative than the modes or medians. So a simple way to improve the use of SETs is to provide more statistical information like the median and the mode and not just the mean. Another thing that we can do is restrict or eliminate the use of qualitative comments, which have the strongest evidence of equity bias. This can be controversial because a lot of people find the comments to be validating sometimes, because there can be a lot of positive comments made as well. But the evidence suggests that women and faculty of color are more likely to receive negative comments about personality traits, appearance, mannerisms, competence, and professionalism. So a thing that we can do is, instead of asking for general comments, assessments should direct students to provide more specific prompts to contextualize their comments. It's also important to note that qualitative comments are problematic for a couple of reasons, including they're hard to aggregate up because of small sample sizes. They are often contradictory and not reliable. They suffer from novelty bias in the sense that people are more likely to remember unexpected or uncommon comments than frequent comments, and also negativity bias. We are more likely to remember negative information than we are likely to remember positive information. And finally, administrators should not rely on SETs as the sole method of assessing teaching. There are several alternatives or supplements to SETs, including peer observation, comprehensive evaluations of teaching portfolios, review of course materials, including syllabi, etc. It's worth noting that these alternative methods that I've just suggested are also susceptible to bias, but they're probably not biased in the same way. And so using multiple imperfect measures is better than relying on just one. So that is my broad overview of the literature, the current scholarly literature on SETs. And I look forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists and answering any questions.
Great, thank you so much. Professor Allen.
Thank you, Irina. Thanks so much again for organizing this panel and inviting me to be here today. So I'm hoping for some robust Q&A and discussion, and so I'm going to keep my remarks brief. I'll start with some comments from one of my early evaluations. Quote, "If she put as much into the course as she does her looks, it would be great." End quote. While my numbers have been consistently good, the comments I've received on evaluations over the last 10 years have been pretty brutal. My brief talk will focus on two factors that affect validity and equity: intersectionality and hierarchy. I find that the bulk of legal scholarship undervalues the counter storytelling aspect of critical race theory. So I'm very intentionally relying on my lived experience along with legal scholarship in my remarks today. The intersectionality analytical framework helps us to understand how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege. Shout out to Kimberly Crenshaw. As Irina mentioned, my recently published UCLA article, "From Academic Freedom to Cancel Culture, Silencing Black Women in the Legal Academy," highlights the ways Black women are silenced in the law school white space. And so I just want to make a couple points pulling from both my own experience and from that article. First, many academics subscribe to the myth of meritocracy, which often ignores Black women's lived experiences with systemic gendered racism and as outsiders in the law school white space. The systemic gendered racism we experience is uniquely tied to a history of subjugation and oppression in the United States. Because intersectional microaggressions often present as neutral, they are very difficult to challenge, yet so many are rooted in pervasive negative stereotypes about Black women. For example, as Mammy, Black women are perceived as caregivers or servants. As Sapphire, Black women are loud, argumentative, aggressive, bitchy, stubborn, and quick-tempered. And as Jezebel, Black women are overly sexualized and promiscuous. And these pervasive negative stereotypes and images of Black women are readily accepted in broad our culture and in mass media. So we see intersectional microaggressions that stem from these pervasive negative stereotypes on student evaluations, when evaluations include comments that Black women law professors are angry, right? We know of the so-called angry Black woman, that they are scary, that they are incompetent, that they are sassy, that they are sexy, that they are ugly. And if you think about the combination of these pervasive negative stereotypes, really we can't win. We can't be too pretty, we can't not be pretty, we can't be too nice, we can't be too stern. And so I'm not quite sure how exactly we can be to overcome many of the things that we often see in evaluations. As outsiders in the law school white space, Black women are presumed incompetent and must work hard to overcome these stereotypes and prove to students and often colleagues that we belong in the law school space. And so Black women pay what I call Black taxes by expending extra energy to ensure that we are meeting institutional norms. Norms that, because of these pervasive negative stereotypes, are virtually impossible to meet. Considering hierarchy, Professor Ruth Gordon aptly observed that law professors spend, quote, their professional lives contesting hierarchy and exclusion, whether on the basis of race, gender, or class. But when it comes to academia, and particularly legal academia, we seem to have found a hierarchy that we can believe in. Black women who teach skills experience both intersectional and hierarchical microaggressions. I've spent all 11 years of my career in legal academia in a skills role, formerly academic support and bar prep, as both a teaching staff person and as a non-tenure track faculty member. And though law schools tout that skills classes are the most important, skills classes are often taught by the folks in the building with the lowest status, as demonstrated by their title, as either an instructional or skills faculty member. So my particular title actually has the skill I teach. I primarily teach in the title, or as non-faculty in non-faculty staff teaching positions. Like the pervasive negative stereotypes of Black women that I just described, students internalize the way law schools devalue faculty lowest on the hierarchy, and this too presents in evaluations. In my experience, both intersectionality and hierarchy have contributed to an inauthenticity in the law school classroom as I sought to meet norms and overcome stereotypes to fit in. In our anti-racist world, law schools are touting diversity as the cure-all for racism. However, as Angela Davis so aptly noted, diversity without structural transformation simply brings those who were previously excluded into a system as racist, as misogynist as it was before. So when thinking about what we can do about these both intersectional and hierarchical issues in equity on evaluations, as someone who's moving from a reformist to becoming an abolitionist, I think that my answer then is that we gotta start from scratch. We have to really address the structural issues that present and lead to inequity in evaluations. And we have to rethink our evaluation practices across the board. And that may even mean getting rid of some of them. So thanks again, Irina, for organizing this panel. As I said, I intentionally kept my comments short because I really hope that we have some time for discussion. I look forward to hearing from the other panelists and also to our Q&A.
Thank you so much, Professor Allen. Professor McFarlane.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. What an honor to be on this panel. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the work that has informed my own professional identity and my comments today. The essay anthology, Presumed Incompetent, and in particular, the essay by my former colleague, Professor Angelique Eaglewoman, influenced me tremendously. My friend and Professor Miradeo and her tremendous book, Unequal Profession, is of great influence on me. And my friends and former colleagues, Sarah Hahn and Shakira Sanders, helped me put all of my evaluations in context and also gave me the strength to sometimes not read them if they had previously been terrible. I'll be discussing disability bias and ableism in teaching evaluations and their practical and legal consequences, especially when those problematic evaluations stay in a professor's file and become part of their tenure and promotion packet. Before I get to evals themselves, I'll provide some background about what the experience of faculty with disabilities is like on law school campuses, either in person or virtual. What ableism looks like in law school, where unfortunately it is rampant. I'll give you some examples of my own evals that are infected with ableism, and then I'll propose a legal framing and some potential solutions to the problems I've identified. So by way of background, what is ableism? Well, simply it's discrimination against people with disabilities, but it can take different forms. So it might mean announcing that people with disabilities can't be law professors or can't be lawyers. We know that's discrimination, but it also may be something more subtle, like planning bonding activities at a faculty retreat that are inaccessible to wheelchair users or people with mobility issues. That too is ableism. So who are professors with disabilities in the legal academy? It's hard to find a number. It's not a demographic that is tracked. I found some number that suggested there are only 1% of law professors with disabilities are disabled. I don't think that's accurate. I think we're underreported for reasons that I'll explain. So under the ADA, disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. What does that mean? Well, being high risk for COVID is a disability. COVID long haulers are disabled under the ADA, and we're going to have to deal with all of the issues that they are confronting in the workplace, especially once we are done with the pandemic. Just as Sonia Sotomayor is a person with disabilities because she has diabetes, and I am too, because I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis at age 1, very early autoimmune diagnosis. I have joint issues and related vision loss. Some disabilities are obvious, many are not. I've often been able to hide my own disabilities. Many law professors have invisible disabilities that they are afraid to disclose. And it wasn't until this year that we had any kind of affinity group for law professors with disabilities. So why is there so much hesitation to identify as a person with disabilities? Well, law schools are not welcoming environments to professors with disabilities. The physical space is often inaccessible. Just think for a moment. Imagine your own courtroom, your courtroom spaces in the law school, and whether anyone who uses a wheelchair can get into your jury box, the witness stand, or even behind the bench. I think the answer is probably no. And accommodations are so difficult to get. They're time consuming, expensive, and often demoralizing to obtain. And then faculty, they see the discrimination experienced by students with disabilities. In fact, how we talk about testing accommodations at faculty meetings, for example, is difficult, right? If you hear that, it feels like an ableist environment. So what about if you're open about being someone with disabilities? Students with disability-related problems then flock to you with their horror stories. So you start to get a sense not only of what's happening to you, but what's happening to disabled people on campus. And our hiring practices are unfortunately ableist. If you had the pleasure of attending the meat market in DC, just think for a moment of the hallways that you had to rush down in those 10 minutes between interviews. What if you were someone with a disability? Could you make it in 10 minutes from one interview to another? Think about the hallways themselves. There's a chair on one side and on another side. A wheelchair can't get down. Anyone using a cane can't get down that hallway, right? And so then back on campus, when I say campus, I mean virtual campus or actual physical campus. Professors with disabilities might be having a very, very hard time in a way that they can't control. It's about their disability, but their workplace isn't accessible. Students don't know the full picture, right? We don't announce, I certainly don't, the full extent of my accommodations and disability on day 1 of class. But there might be things that are actually the result of disability that can annoy students that then infect the way that professors with disabilities are evaluated. What's an example? What if a professor with a disability has to keep very rigid office hours because there are medical appointments that just can't be changed on a weekly basis? And that professor might be perceived to be really inflexible or picky. Or what about during a pandemic, a high-risk professor, high risk for a serious illness from COVID, is really strict about holding only virtual office hours or rushes out of the classroom at the end of class to avoid any kind of social interaction that's closer than 6 feet. Those are issues relating to disability, but they might annoy students, right? Okay, so what does ableism look like in evals? I'm going to share a few of mine, and I want to make clear that as I share these, I can't isolate my gender, right? Gender infects some of what I experience, as does my privilege. I have tremendous racial privilege. I'm blonde, blue-eyed. I look like a lot of my female students, and I mentor quite a few of them. My evals are from my time at the University of Idaho and a semester visiting at Chapman. I don't work at the University of Idaho anymore. Obviously, I'm at Southern in Baton Rouge. So I went over hundreds of my evaluations over the last few days. And I have to say now, stepping back, they're glorious, they're great. I have great evals, but the ones that are bad are truly bad. All right, so let's look at them. Before we do, I have this quote from Miradeo. Course evals give students a risk-free opportunity to convey biases anonymously. I want you to hold on to that thought. If you don't agree now, think about it. Come back to it after you see a few of mine. Okay, here's one ableist or ableism influenced eval, the type I call "you're lazy." So in response to a prompt, which sections of the course, if any, should be emphasized more? Question wasn't answered, but a student wrote, the biggest difference between this professor and all the others is she is sitting down while lecturing. All the other professors stand, walk around the room, and are full of energy that makes the law easier to focus on. All my classmates agree this is a very tired, painful class to sit through, and the professor's lack of energy really makes that all the more egregious. Now, side note, lack of energy has never been a problem in my professional or personal life, but what else was really going on? This is civil procedure. I was visiting at Chapman in the fall of 2019. I was the only female professor that section had teaching a doctrinal course the entire year. So the norm wasn't just people who were standing, it was male professors who were older than me, who went to different schools than I did, who had more status on campus. I think that's why students felt free to let it rip in those evals. They were the worst of my career, and I thought I was a great teacher. I also weighted a midterm much more heavily. I weighted it in a way that was more conventional at my home institution, University of Idaho. I found out too late that at Chapman, the convention was to give them much less weight. I'm sure that influenced my evals. And junior female professors are hazed, and it shows up in our evals. How did I deal with this? Well, I was visiting and no one cared. I don't think anyone at Chapman even looked at these evals. But the following semester, I had the same students, which was very hard. This was a very demoralizing, it was a heartbreaking evaluation. So the first day of class, I didn't lead with it, but at the end of class, I addressed ableism. I talked about it, about disability, about reasonable accommodations, about why I sat down. I probably shared a little bit more than I wanted to about my physical condition, but I explained that that stool had nothing to do with my teaching, that I had that stool that I had to perch on, right? And that they're going to encounter people that need to sit, and that the practice of law is not affected by your ability to sit or stand, and to not make that mistake again. But I can't remove this comment. It's there. It's on a page with a bunch of other of those subjective narrative comments. It just hangs out there, and I hate it. Second type of eval that someone like me gets, you're too political. What does that have to do with disability? Often if you're a member of a minority group, you get liberal progressive politics imputed to you, whether you hold them or not. There are also some patterns here. These are all from the same year, different classes. We'll pull them together at the end, so bear with me. Con Law 1, spring 2018. Dealt with obnoxious corner well. This obnoxious corner was disrupting nearly every class, talking amongst themselves. I don't even get called Professor McFarland. Less of McFarland's problem, more of a reflection of said students' disrespect. Okay, this is strange for an eval. I disliked how the professor constantly inserted her political opinions and beliefs into every class. Same semester, Civ Pro 2, we need whiteboards. The ability to demonstrate complex topics only by PowerPoint is ridiculous. Ridiculous, I tell you. Also, I did not like how the professor inserted her political opinion into every lecture. Con Law 2, fall 2018. Great job reining in the class on certain issues and days. Professor McFarland always has a handle on the class conversations and does a great job reining in nonsense comments from some students. Something is going on here, right? And then a rant, I won't read it all. It's homophobic. It went on longer than this. This isn't the worst language, but it was a similar comment to the others that I've put in red text about my own opinion and something being one-sided being presented in class. So what was going on here? Whiteboards and comments about what kind of tech I use always make me nervous as a person with disabilities because classrooms are very inaccessible. If we had had a whiteboard, which we didn't, which isn't clear, no way I would have been able to use it. I was in a wheelchair at the time that comment was made. I could barely reach the buttons I had to touch to display a PowerPoint. It slowed down class. It was terrible. Never would I have been able to use a whiteboard in that classroom. What did I do that was political? I was so careful about leaning too far to the left that I overcorrected, and I think I leaned way too far to the right, actually, in an embarrassing way, inconsistent with who I actually am. But I did speak openly about the Affordable Care Act and its impact on people with disabilities, and I was very clear that it was personal to me. Other than that, I was very conscious of not leaning too heavily to the left. Is that political? I don't know. What else was going on? These are 3 classes, but they're actually all the same students. So it looks like this huge sample, but it's only 65 students. I had them for 4 required courses overall. And I went back and I looked at these, and now I know, because they were handwritten, all those comments in red were the same student saying the same thing. And now you can see the similarities in language, right? What was going on behind the scenes? There was a group of 3 to 4 male students that were hostile, were really harassing female professors and female students. It was a problem that was brought to the dean of students. Someone should have read these evals and asked me if I was okay and taken immediate action. But instead, this is how it was relayed back to me. This is an excerpt from an annual performance evaluation from that period. So the first sentence criticizes me for having a one-sided approach to some of the issues. This is what was written. What was told to me verbally was much stronger. I was admonished for allowing my political beliefs to enter my lectures and to not let it happen again. I wasn't told what those political beliefs were, or what days I used them, or how to use them less, or it was a bad legal argument, right? Your beliefs, well, you got to identify what they are. Side note, I'm Catholic, so they were actually reading my political beliefs totally wrong. Okay. This is a type of evaluation I call watch out. I'll let you read it for a moment, and then I'll explain its impact on people with disabilities. Okay, for the sake of time, it is concerned about a lot of things. It's singling me out as someone whose bias is more clear. Again, I'm very political. That last sentence, radicalism leads to more radicalism, really scared me. This eval really scared me. It's from civil procedure, where we don't often speak of murder, fall 2020, and it was on the heels of the school's purported commitment to addressing racism and racial justice in our classes. I didn't change my classes too much because I use a lot of Section 1983 civil rights materials in civil procedure. I write about it, that's what I practiced. There's a ton of Section 1983 litigation in the federal courts. It makes sense. I use the complaint filed by the family of George Floyd in a Section 1983 action pedagogically. It was a great example. However, not all of us did what we were supposed to do. And so those of us, quite a few of us women who went for these lessons, got harsh feedback in our evals. I read this eval on January 7th, 2021, and it scared me because of what was going on in the country. There were echoes of what was happening in DC, in Idaho. Why is this about disability? People with disabilities have safety concerns that others do not have. On a bad day, it's very clear that I cannot walk fast. I know in general that I cannot get away from people quickly. I have to be much more mindful of my surroundings. I have to be careful about even where I park. For example, when I would work at the law school quite late, if I parked earlier in the disabled parking spot, I would move my car if I was going to be there late so no one could identify the only person in the building as a person with disabilities. I was so scared that I never went back in the building, never. I left the University of Idaho without returning to the building, and for a myriad of reasons, including this one, I did not go to my last graduation, which was quite sad. So what should have been done there? People need to speak up. I'm delighted that there's someone that sent an email to the student body. any of these, I think there's a way to communicate with students that doesn't put the onus on the person that is experiencing this. So that last eval, I did complain about it. I took it to my associate dean, asked her what to do. She told me to make sure that all viewpoints are welcomed in my class. I don't think that's the kind of viewpoint that needs to be welcome. Talked about it at a faculty meeting, asked for help because I felt unsafe. Nothing happened. I reported it to campus security, said I didn't feel safe, asked them to talk to the student body or my class, at least as a whole. They refused. Anyone who reads an eval like that needs to pull it, needs to check in with the professor to see if they're okay and then pull it. But the problem is the people that are reviewing evals are often victims or vulnerable to the same bias that students who are putting that information in the evals are, right? So this is what I was thinking about. Do we have any lessons to be learned from the pandemic that can help people with disabilities? So here's an example of a semester where my disability was really impacting my experience as a professor. The semester before I went up for tenure, I was in a wheelchair. I found out that the entire law school building was inaccessible. I couldn't wash my hands, couldn't get in and out of my office, couldn't enter the classrooms, the library, the reception area. It was a mess. Getting around in a wheelchair was really time consuming and it was really hard to meet with my students. I killed it in the classroom, but that extra additional aspect of one-on-one interaction was really hard. And students were aware of the access issues and they were kind and supportive, but I didn't feel like I was helping them in office hours the same way I'd been able to before. Why do I say there are lessons that we can learn from the pandemic? We've given people permission to delay tenure, stop the tenure clock because of the pandemic. And at least at the University of Idaho, you had the option because of the pandemic to keep some of your evals out of your tenure promotion file. That would be a really great thing to offer to people with disabilities who are experiencing semesters and issues related to their disability beyond their control to have that option. Now, again, overall, they were decent, but I would have liked to have a little bit more flexibility. I didn't know who to talk to about this because the person that was coaching me through tenure and promotion was the same person who wasn't taking any action with respect to ensuring that there was wheelchair access in the law school building. So again, there's this problem of I'm experiencing this particular kind of bias and discrimination in a particular way, but I don't have someone to go to who really knows how to resolve it. Okay, so what's the solution here? Let's not talk about being more welcoming. People with disabilities don't want to hear about being more welcoming. We want action. So is there any way to really light a fire under people with respect to these evals? So I was thinking through, well, what are the legal consequences? Are they disability discrimination? If a disabled law prof doesn't get tenure or promoted, it's hard. For all those causal link reasons, when there's an adverse action, it'll be really hard to pinpoint it to an eval. This is where I think there's an interesting potential for an employment law claim, a hostile work environment claim. So it can't just be an isolated event. But let me tell you, ableism is rampant. I mentioned this, it's everywhere in law schools. It doesn't happen in isolation. Things are so bad for people with disabilities on law school campuses that I think there's room to make ableist evals part of a hostile work environment claim. Maybe that may cause folks to want to at least pause and reflect on the utility and the consequence of keeping ableism in evals in someone's tenure and promotion packet. Overall, we need a lot more education about ableism. And when we promote people to associate dean or dean positions, we also need to give them education about workplace law along the way. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Professor McFarlane. Professor Scales.
Thank you very much. Happy to join this panel. Unlike the other panelists, I don't write in areas adjacent to this, and my presence here I thought was anomalous when the invitation was extended to me. But for those who haven't kept up with everything you can find on the internet, a few years ago, I was briefly famous. I was in Above the Law, which no law professor really wants to be, and also Marie Claire the same week, which few law professors, I imagine, have thought they might appear. At the time, I was vice dean, associate dean, basically, of law school. And I was reviewing the evaluations, part of my responsibilities. And at Rutgers, we review them before they get posted, obviously, to make sure that there's nothing defamatory or otherwise that could get lots of people into trouble. And so I had to perform this task before uploading these, and I came across one that attracted some attention. In the, I guess, 6 years since, I've never really spoken about this, and my colleague who was the subject of it is really not nearly as reticent as I am, and if she were here, she probably would not object to a complete narration. But I always found it a little uncomfortable, although my own discomfort caused some misperception about the nature of the remarks. So a student in evaluation made comments about my colleague's clothing. And this was, the best way I can describe this would be, it was providing some fashion advice that is the kind of thing you might expect while watching Project Runway. And when I described this in an email to the student body, of course, describing it quite elliptically, many people thought that perhaps the comments had been addressed to provocative clothing or something, or following another earlier comment, maybe my colleague's wearing pants or something like that. I can say that the comments in any other context would probably not strike many women as insulting, but they were absolutely inappropriate for the job that these comments are meant to do, which is to help us understand something about the professor's teaching performance. And for whatever reason, that was the straw that broke the camel's back, and I ended up writing this message to the student body that was on Above the Law 2 hours later. I don't know how that happened. So some thoughts about this. Like as I said a moment ago, as I really made clear in my comments to the students, it's law schools certainly purport to think about student evaluations a lot and take them into account. I want to talk about that a little bit, but a student should not regard this as an opportunity to riff on his or her personal predilections, or do anything other than take it seriously. And particularly given the, in my view, obviously gendered nature of this type of criticism, it really needed to be addressed. I got emails from around the country, from I think overwhelmingly women faculty, maybe one or two weren't, but many women wrote in. They'd had similar experiences. Some of the stories today are certainly consistent with that. And a point that was made earlier that I think really captured what I was reading in these comments was a sense of demoralization. We are somewhat accomplished people. We're here in a very professional setting. For me, certainly, being a law professor was a great honor and professional station. And I think many women and probably other minorities too have been surprised by how easily they can be demoralized by an idiotic comment from some 22-year-old. And that really came through in what I read. That leads me to think about the situation, this panel and what is to be done. And my thoughts on that topic are, I think maybe a little different from some of the other panelists. in my comments to the students and comments made here, we certainly attach importance to student evaluations. I have some questions about how important student evaluations are to in law school internal evaluation processes, the role they play in tenure promotion. I think before I went into teaching, I imagined that student evaluations, teaching evaluations of some kind, would be more significant in professional trajectories than my observations lead me to conclude they actually are. That doesn't mean they aren't important, but it means that we might want to think carefully about which problem we're trying to solve. I like the point that was made, whether or not there's actual legal liability here, I don't know, but I appreciated Professor McFarland's observation that one can certainly think about this as a workplace environment issue. I think that might be, regardless of the legal consequences, one of the soundest ways for law schools to think about it. Do I think that many people are denied tenure as a result of this creeping bias in student evaluations? I'm not very confident that that's true. Could have happened, sure. But if you look at the, and Professor Pritzker's very useful summary, I recommend it, I think it was posted in the chat. If you look at her piece and some others and try to make an estimate, okay, so how much of a hit is there for gender or perhaps racial biases and student evals? One figure I read was on a kind of a 5-point scale. We have about 0.41, which it's statistically significant, sure. It's significant in terms of one might qualitatively say, yes, well, Professor X seems to have lower scores than Professor Y. Does it matter in those attachment points every couple of years where a faculty member is evaluated? Probably not too much, because we just don't care that much about student evaluations when it comes to the incentives within the building. I could imagine this to be true. And I think in other disciplines beyond law, the story is a little bit different. I think that other departments, having kind of suffered from financial issues before the law schools began to suffer from them, maybe put more pressure on untenured people to perform to the expectations of their students. Law schools might be catching up with that, unfortunately. And so it's possible that my skepticism that there is a practical cash out in terms of employment outcomes might be, maybe it's accurate now, but it might not be in a few years. And that's worth thinking about. From my perspective, addressing the inappropriate comments and unhelpful measures of teaching quality, these should be done for their own sake, regardless of whether they are actually causing people to leave the profession or be booted out of the profession. There's some aspects of what Professor Pritzker has said, and I think Professor Brennan's going to talk about this too, where I absolutely agree. Student evaluations are really bad metrics. They ask questions that may or may not be interesting, but which just don't give us great insight into teaching. I really liked Professor Pritzker in her paper, her framing or reframing of how we can expect what maybe we should think about evaluations as a kind of a document of a student experience in the class. I like that. And I think I part company with the idea of eliminating open-ended comments. Now, let's be clear. Open-ended comments are exactly what got the student at Rutgers, not always anonymous, into hot water with me. So it's clearly a potential flashpoint. Nevertheless, when I look at the dry, antiseptic, and often bureaucratically inane standard questions. And then I compare this to what can be a rich vein of insight when you're lucky from a student comment. I would never want to forgo the opportunity to allow students to express their experiences in words that just might not fit into the rubric we've identified in advance with our evaluation methodology. That said, I do think that there is a tremendous amount of noise in student evaluations. In some ways, and I think one of the panelists had a comment, it may have been Professor Allen, I'm not sure, a comment that kind of captured this from a slightly different perspective. One way of thinking about this is that very low signal to noise ratio is exactly what provides a platform for either entirely inappropriate or unhelpfully gendered or race-driven characterizations by students. It's precisely because we are spending a lot of our time looking at inanities or non sequiturs that there's an opportunity where there's space left over for the kinds of comments that animate this sort of conference. And so I'm absolutely in favor of reform. I forgot to the timer on my phone when I started, but someone happened to mention at the beginning of the presentation today that I was going to talk about the institutional resistance to change. Now, this was actually an internal characterization that wasn't what I was supposed to talk about, but let me just talk about for just a minute. I think if you look at some of this literature, it's very unlikely that law schools would be immune from the gender or racial dynamics that will explain some portion of inappropriate student evaluations. And so it's not likely that's going to be the first problem that law schools think they've got to solve. That's not a great explanation. I mean, it's not a very reassuring explanation. Some other not reassuring, but maybe less inculpatory explanations are that law schools where we are not experts in education policy, amazingly enough. We are not experts in measurement, certainly. We're not even great at internal employment law from everything I've observed. And so this is the kind of problem that never seems like it has to be solved today. And again, I just want to reiterate, if law schools really attached weight to student evaluations in the way that maybe, if they attach weight to the evaluation of teaching in a way that maybe we might, our students would probably hope that we do, I think law schools might have identified this earlier as a problem to be solved. And it would mean, maybe optimistically, that the problem of gender or racial bias in evaluations would almost get solved by indirection. If we had a better set of metrics for teaching, for the performance of our teachers, then we certainly wouldn't have as much scope for the kinds of inappropriate comments that have been recited here today. Maybe that's Pollyannish of me. But to me, the problem, which I think Professor Brennan will at least talk about or talk around in some ways, is how can anything be done to improve the quality of that signal? And that might end up taking care of some of the noise issue as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Scales. Professor Brennan.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I'm really happy to talk about this topic. It's something that is of great interest to me, and I think extremely important because of the role it plays in academia. I'm going to actually do some PowerPoints because I have some cute slides and things, and it's more fun than looking at this for 15 minutes anyways. I'm interested in academia as a research topic, and I've written what is effectively a public choice economics critique of higher education. It's about how perverse incentives explain a lot of what goes wrong in academia and why academia has, from a business ethics perspective, bad business ethics. I'm doing this in part because I'm unlike everyone else here. I work in a business school, not a law school. I did take one law class as an undergrad, and that's it. But nevertheless, all the problems we were talking about apply here. So let me just start by talking about the fact that most places have divination rituals, because I think it's going to tell us what's going on. So here I have a quote from Ezekiel. The king of Babylon will stop at the fork in the road, at the junction of two roads, and seek an omen. He will cast lots with arrows. He will consult his idols. He will examine the liver. All cultures have these strange divination rituals. It might be looking at the pattern of birds or smoking certain substances, and then or looking at what happens when you throw tea leaves in water and so on. None of these things work. None of them actually predict the future. So why do they persist? They're invalid as a means of acquiring knowledge, and yet they persist anyways. What explains that? Well, part of it is that there are social and other kinds of benefits or investment in these things, because, for instance, claiming knowledge through a divination ritual can be used to control other people. It can be used to placate the masses. It can be useful for a priest to have control over a king, or for the king to have control over the group. It can be a way of claiming ineffable knowledge, which then gives you advantages over others. It can be a way of demonstrating status and so on. It can even be a mechanism for resolving conflict, and sometimes it's a very efficient mechanism. It's important to note this because I think this is what's going on to explain student evaluations. So student evaluations, to put it bluntly, are biased bullshit. Most of the speakers so far have been explaining how they're biased. I'm mostly going to talk about how they're bullshit. What I mean by that is, if I were to wave my magic wand here and eliminate all bias from student evaluations, we nevertheless shouldn't use them. They are nevertheless bullshit. They don't measure what they purport to measure, right? Why are we using them then? I'll be ending by talking about that. So we've been throwing around these concepts, and maybe a lot of people know what these mean, but in case you don't, just a brief review of what we mean by the concepts of validity and reliability when we're talking about measurement. Validity means the measurement actually tracks the thing that you are trying to track. Right? That's what validity means. Reliable means that when you use a measurement, you get the same score in the same conditions over and over again, right? So this graph here, this picture shows a case where you're constantly getting like the same measurement, so it's reliable, but it's not actually tracking the center. So it's reliable but not valid. This is something where it's highly unreliable. There's lots of variability, but it is sort of centered around like the actual thing you're trying to measure. So it's not very good, but at least it's measuring the right thing. This is something where it's neither reliable nor valid, and this is something where it's both reliable and valid. You tend to get the same scores over and over, and it's actually tracking the center. Overall, the empirical research that tries to assess student evaluations of teaching find that they are, for the most part, reliable in the sense that people tend to get the same scores over and over again, but they are invalid. They do not measure something that we could reasonably call teaching effectiveness. Because they're not valid, we shouldn't use them. I'm an abolitionist on this, and I'll explaining why. Now, it's worth noting when I say that I'm an abolitionist, there are perverse incentives, and that's part of the problem. I get what are considered very high scores. My modal score over the past, since I got promoted to full professor in undergraduate classes, is a 5 out of 5. I think my lowest I ever got was a 4.51. Since then, I usually get about 4.94, 4.95, or 5. In the MBA courses, I get about like a 4.9, right? I selfishly benefit from them because at Georgetown, every year we get evaluations, and our merit raise is determined in part by our teaching. Our teaching is determined entirely by student evaluations. So because I have significantly higher evaluations than my colleagues, I get more money. So literally, student evaluations are buying me guitars. That's what they're doing. I need to say that because I'm going to bash the hell out of them, and I don't want you to think it's sour grapes. Like, I selfishly benefit from the fact that we do this. So I'm going to do something at the end to change that. I'll show you. So let's talk about some things that are other reliable but invalid ways of measuring effectiveness. One thing we could do is, at the end of the semester, have people step on a scale and take a measure of their weight. That would give us pretty reliable scores that get mostly the same score year after year, but it obviously doesn't measure teaching effectiveness. It measures something else. By the way, student evaluations of teaching are pretty highly correlated with weight. So that's part of what we're measuring, is how heavy people are, because students will punish you for being overweight. We could ask Hodor what he thinks of how good you are as a teacher, and he'll respond Hodor every single time. He's perfectly reliable in his response to questions, but obviously he isn't responding accurately or measuring anything. You could take people's one max bench press. How much can you bench press? Your maximum, right? That's pretty reliable, but it also doesn't measure teaching effectiveness. Now, these things all seem absurd, but what we actually do is use student evaluations of teaching. However, they're on par with these things. If we wouldn't take people's one max bench press, we shouldn't use student evaluations of teaching either. Why is it wrong? Before getting to why they're invalid, why would it be wrong? Why would it be? Because I actually think it's morally wrong. I think it's actually not even an option that we use them. It's just wrong. We should just stop doing it like tomorrow, right now. When you get off, don't do them anymore. Because look, I think universities have obligations to students and faculty, and these obligations include things like an obligation to evaluate faculty on the basis of fair, reasonable, and known criterion that are actually valid. They have obligations to students to make sure that teaching is good, which means using reliable and fair and reasonable and accurate and valid measurements of effectiveness. So that's what we should be measuring. And also, if what they actually care about is student satisfaction, which is what these things are closer to being, a student satisfaction rating, they should tell faculty, we don't care about teaching effectiveness. What we care about is student satisfaction. I've been in scenarios where deans have told me that. They've said, this is just a moneymaker for us. We just care that students are happy. We don't actually care about learning. Just make sure they're happy. At least that might be corrupt, but at least they were telling me the truth and I knew what the game was. What's horrible is when you're actually measuring, all you really care about is how happy students are, but you pretend that you care about student learning, and then you incentivize faculty to pretend that they're trying to get them to learn when in fact they're trying to make them satisfied. It's not acceptable. It's also not acceptable because it's deeply unfair. I mean, imagine that we have a plumber being evaluated at the end of say a year for his work. And the boss says to him, Joe, it's time to decide whether you get a raise. Let's shake my magic 8-ball. He says, no, that would be unfair. It's time to decide whether you get a raise. Stand on the bathroom scale. And if you have what's not considered an ideal BMI, then I'm going to give you a lower raise. That'd be terrible. Imagine he says, you're a model plumber and you did a great job, but you're liberal, I'm conservative, so I'm not going to give you a raise. That'd be unfair. Or imagine he says, I find this other plumber more attractive, so I'm going to give that person a raise instead of you. That would be unfair. That's effectively what we're doing with student evaluations when we use them to give people raises and determine any part of merit scores. Why think that? Well, first we have to ask, what is it we're actually measuring when we're measuring teaching effectiveness? We probably don't mean things like the fame or the research prowess of the professor. Having a great publication record doesn't mean that you're a good teacher. Having a poor publication record doesn't mean that you're a bad teacher. Is it student satisfaction, enjoyment, and stimulation? No, things can be really fun and students might not learn from them. Things can be boring and they might learn a lot. Things might be a drag on students, but actually really good for their learning. And in fact, we have evidence that that's often the case. We're not really measuring fun. We're not measuring the quality of PowerPoint slides. Ideally, what we're measuring is something like how much students learn. But even that's complicated and really convoluted and hard to do because we have the problem of student quality. There's selection effects and problems with how good the students are themselves. And so that confounds things like student learning. You would expect that if you measure the amount of learning that took place, say, in an average class at Harvard and an average class at UMass Boston, taught by the same professor, if they just taught between both classes, you would get more learning at Harvard and less at UMass Boston because it's a student quality. On average, students at Harvard will just work harder and learn more and have other advantages that will make them do better. So think about what it would take if you actually wanted to try to prove someone was a good teacher and publish this in a social scientific journal. What sorts of statistical controls would you have to put on in order to make sure that you don't just get destroyed by your referees who say, you didn't control for all these confounding factors. This is obviously a garbage study. You'd have to put in quite a bit. These student evaluations of teaching that we use, you could never publish that in a reputable social scientific journal because they have such poor statistical controls. And yet we're using them to actually evaluate faculty and determine their raises and things like that. Seems absurd. We have to ask our mean scores. I put scare quotes when I talked about my mean scores. And one of the reasons I put scare quotes is because it's not clear that there actually is such a thing as a mean score. It's not really clearly coherent. Most of the time, when you look at the way surveys are written, students are asked to evaluate faculty on some sort of like a scale that's qualitative, and then the numbers are supposed to stand in for qualitative things, but you can't average qualitative judgments. Good plus excellent plus fair plus poor divided by 4 equals nothing. If you make them convert this to a numerical scale, that's just false information. It's just bad mathematics. It doesn't make any sense. Sometimes these scales are written on, some sort of ordinal scale. This is the best or the worst or deviation from 0, but they're not told to make sure to treat the scale as constant. And in fact, they don't. We know that they don't. And then when we take an average, we're basically trying to average ordinal numbers together that literally cannot be averaged. So there's already a mathematical incoherence in this, which should be enough to just stop the question. The way that, or at the very least, you'd have to rephrase how you ask students about this and reevaluate, like, or like change the way that the surveys are done, because we already have incompetent, incomprehensible mathematics taking place. But it gets worse. So there's a number of really good summary articles. I'm just going to post a couple of them in the chat, but I have many, many more if you need them, that have tried to look very carefully at, do students learn, student learning, if we carefully measure actual student learning and control for confounding factors, and then compare that to student evaluations of teaching, what do we find? And the answer is, this is really the scope of the debate over the last 30 years when people became sophisticated about studying this. It's either they're not related or they're slightly negatively correlated. Right. So that's like when if I say I'm getting high evaluations, what you should be doing in response to me is saying that either means nothing, or it means you're maybe a slightly worse than average teacher, because that's the range of the debate on this at this point. So a very famous paper by Udall, White, Wong, Gonzalez in 2017 is a meta-analysis looking at all sorts of major studies trying to carefully try to measure teaching effectiveness versus student evaluations. What they find is that once you put in multi-section studies where you control for prior learning, you control for students like prior background ability, then the correlation between SAT scores and actual learning correlations is extremely weak, accounting for maybe about 1% of variance in learning, right? And then when you put in even further controls, you get no effect at all. It's just zero, right? In particular, what do they mean by multi-section study design? They mean things like, you have a course with multiple equivalent sections. They have the same outline, the same assessments. Students randomly get assigned to different sections so that you're not getting a selection effect of the students. You have different sections taught by different instructors. All instructors are evaluated at the same time with the same SETs and so on. And you objectively measure learning with some sort of instrument that's supposed to be valid. And then you compare that with SAT scores. What you find is no correlation or slight negative correlation. Now, this is actually one of the reasons, by the way, why schools do not validly measure teaching. Most of these experiments are done at military academies where you can force students to take particular classes. You have to take a class with Adam, and you have to take a class with Rebecca, and you have to take a class with Jay, and you have to take a class with Renee. In order to actually know really how much it's about the student versus the faculty member, you need to control student behavior that's incompatible with student freedom. And so you only really get these experiments being done at military academies where people can be told what to do. Similarly, a very famous paper by Clayson in 2009 does another kind of major meta-analysis of hundreds of papers. And this is a sort of summary of it. Basically, back in the 70s, when people were relatively unsophisticated in their statistical analysis, they started to say that it looks like these evaluations are valid measures of teaching effectiveness. However, as soon as people started putting in the basic controls that you would need to get published an econ article in a third-rate econ journal, just basic statistical controls, you lose all of the correlation. And so they say no study can be found after 1990 that showed a positive significant relationship between learning and the SAT. Right. This is more stuff about how if you really wanted to measure it effectively, you'd have to assign students randomly a class. You'd have to control for student ability and so on and so forth. And belabor that. One of my favorite recent studies that came out actually was about particular teaching methods in class, just to illustrate how poor students are at evaluating their learning. And this goes back to some of the things other faculty have talked about today. So what they did was they had one class where the professor gets up and just barks information at the students. And then they ask students, how much do you think you've learned? And they say, I've learned a lot. Then they give them a test and they score how much they've actually learned. And they give them a test before and ahead of time so they know how much they've learned. They did the same thing, but now a professor used an active teaching method where students had to think Socratically and so on. They asked the students, how much do you think you've learned? The students think, not very much, because I was confused for almost the entire hour. I was very confused. And then they give them the test. And in fact, the students with the active learning method believe themselves to have learned less, but measurably have learned more. So it feels like they've learned in the first one because the professor just explained everything. It doesn't feel like they learned in the second one because they were confused. This kind of thing is showing up in our teaching evaluations, because if you use active teaching methods, students will punish you as compared to using methods that are relatively easy. And others have already mentioned that. This is just one of many, many experiments that get the same result over and over and over. So what do we do about it? Here's some bad defenses that I've heard. One is that we have to do something to measure student effectiveness or the effectiveness of teaching, and this is something, so we should do it. No, right? We might as well just have people do their max 1 rep bench press. Like if it's not a valid measure, it's not a valid measure. We shouldn't use it, right? And it's not, well, we should keep using it till we think of something else that's better. If it's not a valid measure, you don't keep using it. You just stop using it. People say, well, what about things like peer evaluations? Because the literature on peer evaluations where, say, Professor Scales comes and sits into my class and talks about how good he thinks I am, that turns out to be highly biased, unreliable, and invalid too. So should we use those? Not I bet you actually do a great job. I'm just picking you because your face is closest to mine on my windows over here. But like that turns out to be invalid too and not very reliable. So we shouldn't use those either. They're not a good supplement. We shouldn't use both of them. We shouldn't mix them. We really actually don't know how to measure teaching effectiveness in any kind of quick and easy and valid way, right? In part because in order to measure it, you have to do these controlled experiments, which violate student freedom. I think at some point we just have to admit to students, yeah, we don't know how to do it, so we're not doing it, right? Like there are lots of things I don't know how to do. Like I don't know how to say, call lightning from the sky using my wishes. So I don't make promises that I'm going to try. I just admit that that's my failing. Universities should just admit we can't really measure teaching effectiveness in a valid way. We don't know. They're better than nothing. No, they're not. This last hour and a half has shown they're not better than nothing. Maybe we just need to use them the right way. Well, what's the right way? If they're an invalid measure, how do we use them the right way? Sometimes people say, you're right, but if you get low scores lower than a 2.5 out of 5, that means you're bad, but we should just ignore anything above a 2.5. No. Actually, oftentimes people measurably learn a lot from low scoring things, but they punish the professor because they were a hard grader. They thought they were unfair. They were confused because they used an active learning system. The professor did something which was really good for them, but they don't like it. And they'll punish that professor by giving them a low score. But in fact, measurably, the students have learned a lot. There's no reason to think these are valid measures. By the way, why do they persist? Well, one reason is because surveys of college administrators overwhelmingly show that administrators think that they are valid methods. So there's dozens and dozens of these surveys where they'll ask like deans and others, do these things validly measure teaching effectiveness? And overwhelmingly deans, presidents, and so on say that they do. Admins believe mistakenly, despite the overwhelming research to the contrary, that fun, the attractiveness of professors, holding parties, dumbing down grading have no effect or little effect on SAT scores. The research shows otherwise. Why don't admins' beliefs line up with the evidence? What's going on? Why do they continue to believe in this? Why don't they just follow the science? There's so much science, right? It's overwhelming how much there is. It's such an easy question, right? Like we know more about this than we know about, say, masks and COVID or something. Why don't we just follow the science? Well, we have perverse incentives. One is that the SAT is relatively cheap and it's easy to implement. It's easy to do. You send out a survey. The other is, as I talked about briefly, actually trying to measure effectiveness is incredibly expensive and difficult, and it's not clear you can do it without violating student freedom. Finding a new and better system is expensive, so you have a perverse incentive not to do that. It's really hard to get up and admit to students that you've been wrong for the past 30 years. Who wants to do that, right? That looks bad, so no one wants to do that. Further, when you create these systems, you have entire bureaucracies at universities filled with staff, well-meaning staff, whose job it is to implement and do this work. They will aggressively lobby to protect the SATs when they come under threat. Further, students don't know, generally speaking, from these surveys that the SAT is invalid. So the university has this perverse incentive whereby using the SAT, they create the appearance that they care about teaching, even though they don't really. They create the appearance that they're trying to improve teaching, even though objectively speaking, they're not. So you're tricking the customer into thinking that you're doing a good job for them. Further, when you think about the conflict between admins and faculty, where we're all fighting over power and resources, when you use SAT scores, this gives admins a heads up and power over faculty in that fight. It helps allow them to fire people and keep them in their place and so on. And finally, some faculty benefit from them and thus push to keep them. People with high SAT scores often want to keep using them because they get raises. What would it actually take to fix it? Well, someone mentioned this in the chat, and I actually went to Canada recently to talk to the National Association of Academic Vice Presidents and Provosts, because at Ryerson University, there was a big court case that went to arbitration, and faculty members won, saying that you're not allowed to use these to evaluate us because they're invalid. Because of how Canada's common law system works, NatVac and the other people who are associated with this are worried that this means that no universities will be allowed to use them in the long run. And they're, because of the law case, thinking about trying to find a new sort of method, whether they actually can. So maybe lawsuits and things will actually fix it. So I'm going to stop and just to sort of put my money where my mouth is, because I've been talking about how they're bullshit, even though I benefit from them. I'm going to do one thing right now. It turns out at Georgetown, I learned this very recently. Course evaluations are optional. For information on how to opt out of evaluations, you can reach out to main campus eval at georgetown.edu. Apparently, I'm not required to use them, even though my evaluations at the end of the year for merit 35% of my raise will supposedly be determined based upon my student evaluations. So I'm going to send this email. Hi, I'm a professor at MSB. I'd like to opt out of course evaluations henceforth since they're invalid measures of teaching effectiveness. I'm doing this in protest despite getting high scores. Please let me know what I must do to proceed. I'm going to email them. That's my department head. That's my vice dean. So at the very least, I'm not going to play along anymore because, like I said, they're bullshit. So thanks. And I'm happy to hear people's comments and questions. Thanks for letting me rant about this for 15 minutes.
Thank you so much, Jason. So here's what we're going to do now. I want to give people the chance to drop questions in the Q&A section. Some of them have been answered through the process by some of our speakers. And I'm just going to throw out a question while people maybe have the attendees have the opportunity to write down their questions. Let's assume that the abolitionists are correct, right? Based on the data that Jason and others presented, what would a world look like without evaluation of teaching? So until we come up with a system that is valid, that meets, is not biased, doesn't run into all these problems, ethical problems, potential legal problems, and so on, what would that world actually look like? And what are the concerns and how could they perhaps be addressed? So whoever wants to get started on that. Otherwise, I'm going to make Jason if nobody volunteers, because he was sort of the strongest. Let's get rid of them. So Jason, what would you think would happen? Would it be sort of a parade of horribles? Like what is the true concern here?
I mean, what do I expect would happen versus what I think should happen? What I expect would happen is if we eliminated them, we would find some other relatively inexpensive, low time consuming, but invalid measures such as peer evaluations, because we have perverse incentives, right? Like I, as a faculty member at a Research One university, my incentive is to spend as much time as possible on research and minimize my time spent on everything else, right? Research is where the money is. Like literally, especially at Georgetown, in the business school, if you publish 2 A-level journals articles in a year, you get a summer research bonus worth 2/9 of your salary. Who wants to do service, right? So we have all these perverse incentives. So I think we would replace them with something else that sucks. Exactly which of the crappy things we would do, I'm not really sure. And by the way, this is a deeper problem. Students don't actually learn very much in college. When we try to measure over and over again, how much do people learn and how much do they retain of what they do learn, the results are pretty depressing. Maybe it's not, given that hardly anyone's learning, maybe it's not our fault. Maybe it's just that by the time they get to college, people just don't learn very much. They've already kind of learned what they're going to learn. But it's a deeper problem than just like how to measure teaching effectiveness. We have this pervasive problem of students just measurably not gaining hard or soft skills, in fact, losing many of their hard skills during their college years, with only a small percentage of students showing anything like significant gains in their teaching and in their academic abilities. So yeah, it's a real massive problem. We should feel bad about it. I don't know how to solve it, but I'm pretty sure whatever comes as the solution, we won't do it.
Okay, maybe some of you who are or have been administrators could comment on whether, I mean, it hasn't really been said out loud, so I'm going to. Do we believe that people are just going to stop doing their job properly, whatever that means, right? And I see some hands, Renee and Rebecca, maybe you can comment, and then Adam.
Yes, so 2 things. First, I don't believe that, and I'll just use my own experience. I don't believe that we don't know who the not so great teachers are in law school. I mean, this is what happens in the office conversations, in the whispers, in the things behind the scenes. I've been told from administrators, so-and-so is not a great teacher. Everybody knows this. And so then what really are we using these evaluations for, right? Because the folks who aren't great teachers and maybe could benefit from improving their teaching aren't realizing that through some student evaluation process. But outside of that, I think, if we got rid of them, not thinking about what they don't measure, teaching effectiveness, right? If we got rid of them, for me, and for, women who look like me and experience the world the way I do, it would limit some of the trauma associated with trying to fit, my round self into a square, or the opposite, my square into a round hole, right? Like it's never gonna fit. And I can negotiate my identity in a number of ways, but because of the ways in which law schools exist, this is never going to work out. And so I'm thinking from an experience approach, what it would do would eliminate some of that trauma. There's very real physical consequences to having to endure year after year, semester after semester, these types of comments, and knowing that they are coming, and knowing that there's very little that you can do about it.
Great. Rebecca, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly. I agree with all of that. I think it's hard to imagine what it would be like if there were no forms of SETs, in part because there's been so much resistance to getting rid of them. I don't think they're good measures of teaching. And so I would also like to be an abolitionist, but I'm also a pragmatist, and I don't see institutions by and large getting rid of them in their entirety. I think this question is so complicated because there needs to be some way for accountability for instructors, but there's also some role that teaching evaluations can play, like a fire alarm role, which is that if they're, as much as I said that the qualitative comments can be rife with concerns and all of these sexist, ableist, racist comments, occasionally they do also draw people's attention to valid concerns about things that are happening in the classroom. So I think this is really complicated because I don't think that we can get rid of having any measures of teaching when we're universities. So I think that's a struggle. I don't see most universities getting rid of them in the US anytime soon. And so that's why I advocate for how we can try to use them in less bad ways. But I do think that, I think that's important that we still keep in mind that it's important to know how students are experiencing classes. So SETs at least can be a reflection of like their experiences, not learning.
And we're seeing now some, and maybe we'll talk about those as well, some compromise solutions, whether they're good or not, but some compromise solutions where like at the University of Oregon, where they've removed the numerical system and have made it kind of less simple for administrators to be able to compare apples and oranges and different instructors, but still give some indication potentially to the instructor about what students think about how things are going. Adam.
Thanks. Brandon, Jason, I would definitely give you at least a 4.9 for your presentation, not just because you're funny and entertaining, because it's very good. So again, speaking as a former associate dean, I listened to Professor Allen's comment a moment ago, and the idea that everyone in the hallway knows that Teacher X is bad, and certainly we've all seen those conversations, but I think some of the discussion today should invite us to ask whether what everyone knows is true actually is. I mean, how exactly do we know this? I mean, I've not observed maybe once for a pre-tenured person. Do we actually sit in on each other's classes and really get insight into how our colleagues teach? No, we don't. We're doing our own thing. I think Professor Brennan identifies quite accurately the institutional incentives at work here. It's very difficult for me to imagine that the bureaucracy, the organization would give up a potential tool of discipline, even though it's lightly used, and very few people are ever going to get fired for being bad teachers. It is important, at least for the credentialing process, the university tells itself about how it operates. And I can't imagine that going away. How do I think professors would respond? Well, it's interesting. When I was associate dean, there's a current colleague of mine, absolutely brilliant individual, spectacular teaching evaluations. But the teaching was so unusual. It just didn't fit into any of the box that we have as to what good teaching should look like and what we think teachers should do, but the students loved it. But when he would describe his approach, I thought, God, I wish I had professors like that. And so, what chart is this guy going to fit in properly, right? He hits all the right numbers, but they probably don't. He's very entertaining. You think Brennan's entertaining? This guy is spellbinding. All right, so those numbers don't mean anything And yet at the end of the day, it would be a mistake to take his idiosyncrasies and conclude that he's not an effective teacher. Two other quick points. Someone in the chat asked, well, can we use bar passage as a measure? It's an increasingly salient issue. The problem is the bar exam is terrible. I mean, if you think law school exams are terrible and law school student evaluations are terrible, wait till you see the bar exam. I could teach a reasonably bright college graduate without any law school how to pass the bar exam. It's a terrible exam. And these factors, student success in the bar is likely to have very little to do with what we are doing in school. Finally, there's a question I said was answered in the Q&A. Joshua Sarnoff, I'm not sure I got your name correct, about peer evaluations. And Jason addressed this, I think, in his comments, but one problem with that is you're only getting snapshots. So I'm sure many of you have sat in, for pre-tenured people, sat in on a couple of classes, and that's interesting, but really you just don't have a sense as to what this class is like day in, day out, whether the person's really on his or her A game that day. As I was when I was evaluated, I made sure I actually absolutely knew the material cold that day. It wasn't going to improvise. And so I just don't think that's a useful substitute.
Hari.
So I definitely get, wearing an administrator hat on this panel. And, look, I think this question of what to do is really tricky. So I'm a big believer that when we have a problem, we got to figure out kind of concrete solutions to them and ways to move forward. I've been lucky enough to be both dean at institutions and a faculty member at institutions that use multiple measures of teaching and have very explicit tenure standards around teaching that list a bunch of different things and actually don't list student evaluations first, right? So it becomes one thing among many, which I know was one of the things that Professor Pritzker suggests. And I do think that administrators who have an understanding of the problematic issues around, what can happen in evaluations are able to, I think it's about how you use, it's partially also about how you use them as an administrator, right? And about, recognizing the various problems that we've been talking about today. The thing I struggle with is this. I completely take Professor Allen's point that we don't want a mechanism in our law schools that are traumatizing for our professors, right? That is, and in particular, we know, that it's not like all professors are getting these comments, right? So, I really take your point about kind of the experiences of Black women and which I obviously don't have the lived experience of, and the need to deal with the fact that, when people read things like that, this is a trauma, right? So then the question is there a way to, and this is what I've been struggling with listening to this whole panel, is there a way to give students an opportunity to tell us about their experience? Because I do think it's important for us to have some way of I'm a really big believer in inclusive leadership and in every member of our community trying to support, having a supportive growth environment for all of them. And so, I think the question is there a way that we can hear about students' experiences in a class that doesn't have all of the problems that we're talking about today. And I'm not sure exactly what that looks like, but I think that's the part of what we I see the comment in chat, right? Which is, from Professor Sarnoff and others, right? Like, so, yeah, and I do think that some of the suggestions that Professor Pritzker made about how we word the questions, how, and others have talked about too, how open-ended we allow answers to be, right? I think, so we don't give them room maybe to make some of those kinds of comments as easily. I mean, so the question is there some way we can learn about student experience beyond them just coming to talk to me and the associate dean and the dean of students, that's more valid and isn't going to be as problematic. So I don't have the answer of exactly what this should look like, but I'm committed to the idea that we need to continue to figure out what that could look like, and if we could design something like that's better, right? And then I guess that the last thing I want to say is I do think we need to care about teaching. Right? I mean, there's a reason that teaching is one of the 3 things we care about in tenure standards at every university I've been at and am aware of. And at some universities, I think that these issues get used in really unhealthy ways. But I do think, and I have seen it at some of the healthier places I've been, where and part of what I've been struggling with here is I'm a big believer, for example, in learning leadership, right? I'm an imperfect human, and I'm continuously trying to get to be a better dean than I started. And similarly, when I was a teacher, I was trying to figure out how to be a better teacher, even within all of the constraints that we were just talking about. And most universities have resources where we can work on our teaching skills, right? Like, so a number of big universities have actual teaching centers that help you think about your pedagogy, et cetera. And I have seen situations where a junior professor was struggling the first time they taught something. The university constructively worked with them in a non-punitive way to kind of get some of those resources around teaching, and the teaching improved. Right. And so I want to think about how we can constructively, support people in being really strong teachers. I think we owe that to our students. And at the same time, not like get at these problematic things that we're hearing about on this panel.
Thank you. Catherine.
Hi. So I want to think about the problematic student evals that are kind of terrorizing us, to use a word that Renee uses in her scholarship, the concept of academic terrorism, and think about it as a community issue. And often there are experiences that female law professors have, that women of color have, that students are having too. Like we sometimes are mirroring the same experiences. So if they're in the slide where I showed all those complaints about male students acting up in the classroom, there was communication with the dean of students about these particular male students and what they were doing to female students, what they were doing to female law professors, but it never turned into how can we talk about this as a law school and also flag it and be sensitive to the way that we're evaluating the female law professors who have to deal with these male students who are hurting the entire community. So I think we can think about it big picture and think about it as solving a community-wide problem. I love the idea of low stakes feedback, and some of the most useful feedback, probably because I wasn't so nervous about it, was my 3rd year review, the year before I went up for tenure. And it was simple. It was things like, you need to do more hypotheticals, Kat, which was totally true. It was an easy fix. It made class better. It was not mentioned in any of my student evals. I needed a more seasoned professor to come in and look at my classes. And finally, I think that as people who sit on tenure and promotion committees, we now have these recordings of classes that you can speed up to 2 times the regular speed. I think we have the ability to watch a little bit more and get more of a sense of what people are doing across several classes. And I would give people the opportunity to select either recordings or to give as much notice as possible about which classes, or invite them to choose the class they'd like to be visited. That may seem like you're giving them the ability to be on their best behavior, but yes, like let them be evaluated on their best day, as opposed to when they're caught off guard and are dealing with nerves, as opposed to the content of their lecture.
Renee, did you have your hand up?
I did, but I took it down. I'll wait.
I mean, a couple of things that I wanted to throw out there, thoughts I had while some of you were speaking. One concern that might be there in terms of getting rid of, for example, or limiting the qualitative comments is, yes, on the one hand, we might get rid of some hurtful comments, but on the other hand, it seems like oftentimes the numerical values end up having much more of an effect. So for example, in what Jason was describing in the system he's been living in, the way that those are used for, used in the salary structure or things like that. And also that might end up hiding biases because like, well, the numbers are objective. It's just the comments that are the problem. So I'm actually not sure, while the comments are clearly sort of the most hurtful in the moment, I am not sure that they are the bigger problem between the numbers and the comments if we were to choose one. The other thing I want to throw out there, and that's in part in response to Adam, why does this even matter? Most of the time, these don't end up tanking someone's tenure and so on and so forth. So I think it's going to be potentially an issue for different people at different points. So certainly if we look at the undergraduate institutions and adjuncts professors there it really could be make or break, and that's it. And you're going to be fired, end of story. And even like at law schools, if it's a professor that is not on the tenure track, not tenured, that could end up making a difference. Oftentimes also the concern seems to be that these end up getting used in a pretextual manner. So let's consider, for example, a lateral setting. You don't like somebody, you don't like a candidate that just came in, but you just don't like them. It could be ideological. It could be that you're scared they're going to look better than you on the scholarly front. It could be any number of horrible reasons, but you're going to say like, oh, well, look at those evaluations, right? We cannot possibly hire that person. Or let's say you have another candidate that you prefer, and that other candidate has better evaluations. What perfect opportunity to say, well, we've got two great people, but you know what, the evaluations are just 0.5 higher for this one person, so we should hire them. So I think those are oftentimes the context in which we're seeing this matter in law schools, and whether it's decisions going forward, rationalizing there, or rationalizing decisions that were made in the past. Adam, would you like to respond?
Yeah, just a quick point. I certainly like your point that for people who are on the internal tenure track, and certainly for laterals, there's more opportunity for mischief. I will point out, in this kind of, I guess we cuts against us both in a way, that I actually think that it is the open-ended comments that are more likely to provide the mood music for the kind of faculty discussion you're describing. I mean, you know, a 0.5 difference in your overall evals, I mean, probably not. But someone says, you know, this person is difficult, you know, whatever the student says, and that becomes an organizing theme. Now, of course, I just argued in favor of keeping these comments, and you did too. But I almost think that for the point that you were making a second ago, the open-ended comments actually might be worse or more of a risk than the closed-ended numerical scores. That was it.
Yeah, and I'll throw in that, you know, I'm not sure if you think about a 5-point scale of 4.2 versus a 4.7, I can definitely see some people in the law school setting making a big sort of stink about that kind of a distinction. So, Hari.
Yeah, I just wanted to amplify one of the Q&As, because I think it's getting at why this is like hard to figure out the path forward, which was a point that that Gina Shaw made, right? And it's just that first sentence I want to make sure everybody sees, which is that our law students, many of whom come from marginalized communities, want to be able to complete these evaluations to anonymously express their experiences with a professor, and for faculty to spot problematic trends in this regard, and of course correct, right? So I think this is at the heart of the dilemma to me, is how do we provide an opportunity for students to share their experiences, but do it in a way that addresses the concerns that we're talking about. And I know there in this Q&A, there are some specific suggestions, and Professor Scales and Professor Shaw talk about them, but I just wanted to flag that, because I do think that that's part of, like, we have to think about how we support student voice, and at the same time, how we make sure that we're, you know, in a constructive way, working with faculty around teaching.
Great. We're almost out of time, but Rebecca and then Renee, and then we'll close there.
I'll be speedy in my comments. So I think this all comes down to, how do we use this? How do we use the evals? How are these data being used? And so this question about the quantitative and qualitative, again, it's like, what are we doing with it? So the qualitative comments, the evidence suggests is where we're most likely to have all of these issues of gender, race, ableism, bias coming in. And it's also suffering from, remember, this novelty bias or the unusualness bias. And so we tend to harp on the parts of our qualitative comments that are the most anomalous. And so the least representative, from that perspective. And so on the other hand, I still think that there's room for collecting qualitative data because it's a way of gathering information about experiences. It can be an important fire alarm for if there are any issues in the classes, because certainly not all students will feel equally comfortable going to the dean to express some concerns that they've had about a class. So the devil's in the details. What do we do with this? How do administrators and other people use these comments, and under what context are they, processing them and doing anything with it? So I think it's very challenging, but the most important thing we can take away with it is that we need to be much more conscious about what we're doing and and the implications of how we're using this.
Renee.
Just very quickly, and going back to something the dean said, I do think that it is important for students who are marginalized to have a space where they can express what they're experiencing in the classroom. The folks who I said earlier that we know about, I mean everything from teaching effectiveness to also racism and sexism. And students who are in those classrooms and have to endure that certainly deserve a space where they can identify those things. Whether that space continues to be student evaluations, which don't generally amount to much because those folks still continue to teach and operate in law schools, that doesn't seem to be a very effective approach to getting to answering those student concerns. And if we are all interacting with students in ways outside of just relying on what they say in student evaluations, then again, I do think we are, as we administrators, we folks in skills positions who are constantly, as a part of our jobs, interacting with students about their academic performance and learning from them about their experiences. I think there are a number of ways that we are pretending then to use student evaluations as a way to assess effectiveness, though totally ignoring what we hear both in person and what we see in writing over and over in those evaluations. And so we aren't really using them to address problems that I would argue we are aware of, that we know exist among our faculties and in our buildings.
And I would like to just echo one last time a point that Renee made earlier, which was that of the tax, because it also came up in Q&A, where we should query in the future, even when we see equal numbers, for example, or similar qualitative comments between members from different types of groups on the faculty, the amount of labor that went into it on the part of these different faculty members, if in some cases it had to overcome whatever degree, even severe degree of bias. So I thought that was an important point I wanted to make sure to amplify also. Hari, would you like to have the last, the final word?
I don't want the last word, but I just want to say one very quick thing, which is that to Professor Allen's point, I think that deans have an obligation to intervene if there are problematic things going on in classrooms. So I think, I'm not saying it's happening all the time in law schools, but it should. And I at least feel an obligation as a dean that in the same way that I need to be a voice in the room. So if someone says something problematic in a faculty meeting, I need to speak up, right? So I do think that we as leaders can set a tone and intervene when we see problematic things. And I just wanted to say, I think that's something that we should be doing as leaders.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dean Osofsky, and all of our wonderful speakers and everybody who asked questions and who attended. I really enjoyed this event. I'm glad we got to do this today. If anyone wants to continue this conversation, I think you know where to find all of us. And certainly today was a start rather than a finish, and this will give us a lot of food for thought. So thank you so much to everybody and to Northwestern Law.